And Jamie. And Jamie, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. Let me just kill that on my screen. There we are. Good. Trying to get through a terribly complicated battle, or actually two battles, both of which rejoice in the name of Inkerman. But just to remind you, this is the third lecture of the great maneuver battles of the Crimean campaign, not war, the great Crimean campaign. It's only called the Crimean War from about 1877 onwards. Before that, it's always known as the Russian War. Why? Because it's fought on several different fronts: White Sea, Baltic Sea, Black Sea, Pacific, etc., etc. We tend just to concentrate on the Black Sea and the Crimea, and it's become called the Crimean War quite wrongly. Worth bearing in mind that in this conflict, the very first Victoria Cross was awarded, but it was awarded in the Baltic to a sailor, hurrah, rather than to a soldier in the Crimea. Anyway, we can go into that later on. What I want to talk about this evening is the third great maneuver battle. So we've done Alma on the 20th of September, 1854. We've done Balaclava on the 25th of October, 1854. And we're going to concentrate tonight briefly on the operations of what they call Little Inkerman of the 26th of October, and then the huge battle, the most decisive battle of the Crimean campaign on the 5th of November, 1854, until Sevastopol falls itself with the attempted assault on Sevastopol of the 18th of June, 1855, and then the actual fall of Sevastopol, which would be contested by the Russians whether it ever fell or not. Come back to that in a moment. Excuse me, which kills and injures far more people, the siege of Sevastopol, than any of the battles that I've been talking about. Alma, essentially infantry. Balaclava, essentially cavalry. And then on the day after Balaclava, on the 26th of October, 1854, Jamie, may I have the first map, please? Oh. The Russians, fresh from their victory at Balaclava, therefore launch another assault, but this time they launch the assault against, could you just, that's it, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jerry. They therefore launch their attack against the right or the eastern flank of the Allies, namely the British in this case, on the field of Inkerman. Now, I'm just going to take this opportunity to try and describe the ground. The ground is incredibly difficult. I've walked this field, I don't know, 30, possibly 40 times. Several people that are listening tonight have been on the ground with me. And even after 4 or 5 hours that we spent, maybe longer, that we spent walking across the ground, they are perplexed as when we came onto the ground in the first place. It's taken me ages to try and sort the battle out. I've written a couple of books about it, available from all good booksellers. Wouldn't dream of plugging my own products, of course. But we're looking here at the eastern flank of the Allied position up on the heights of Inkerman. Now, off to the left of the map, to the west, lies the great city of Sevastopol, which is under siege. Off to the right of the map lies the river Chernaya, which you can see on the top right element of the map. And then surrounding the Chernaya, a deep, deep valley with a river running through it, with the river running through it, but with also boggy ground either side. Top of the map, you can see, top right of the map, you can see something marked Inkerman, which is actually the high ground that was in the Russian-controlled part of the territory. And then coming back from the northeast towards the southwest, you have got the terribly difficult broken ground of the field of Inkerman proper. It's not Inkerman, it's just a name that the British have adopted at the time. Running from the top left corner to the bottom right corner is a thing that looks like a lobster's claw. That's called the Careening Ravine, And it is a deep, dark ravine to this day, with several different juts that come off it, Nowadays, it's actually quite heavily furred and treed. It wasn't at the time. And then along the top of the map, you can see these various different ravines, which stretch from sea level to quite high. I'm sorry, you're going to ask me how high, I don't know. But very steep ascents of these gullies and ravines, upon the top of which you can see at the sort of central bottom right part of the map, the British position on Home Ridge, and this will become clearer later on, and then northwest of Home Ridge, Shell Hill. The second map is clearer from this point of view. I just want to use this map to orient you about where Sevastopol is, and if you look top left corner, you can see the Little Redan and the Malakoff, so in other words, Russian defensive positions sticking out there, and in particular the Little Redan, which dominates the careening ravine, already mentioned, this great lobster's claw thing that comes right down into the British position. Now, to orient you further, the Allies are occupying a horseshoe-shaped position with the French tucked in to the left, with their left shoulders on the sea and their point of disembarkation and logistics, namely the port up to the left, and the British over on the eastern side, not only prosecuting the siege, not only providing troops for the siege lines, but also holding the whole of the eastern side of the Allies' position along this horseshoe-shaped ridge, which is called the Sapoon. So the northeastern side of the Sapoon is called Inkerman, and that's where we're looking at the moment. And the British, in particular, de Lacy Evans' second division, have the two tasks of not only providing troops for the siege, but also providing lookouts on this flank to make sure that the enemy's army of the interior, so not the Russians who are besieged in Sevastopol, but the troops that are cutting around mobile out on the eastern side, that they've also got an eye on them. Now, very quickly, after the success at Balaclava for the Russians on the 25th of October, the next day, phase 2, Colonel Fedorov, who is just that, a colonel, is given 6 battalions and 8 guns to move parallel to the careening ravine. So the thing in the center of the picture that looks like the lobster's claw, to come along the high ground and to try and occupy Shell Hill, which will look down due south, or a spot of east on south, right the way across the valley, looking at where the British position is, which is armed, has got a series of redoubts on the top of that, in order to try and probe the British position. The morning of Sunday, the 26th of October, dawns fairly sunny. The bells in Sevastopol are ringing out the victory of the day before, the Battle of Balaclava. And along this piece of high ground, so top left towards the sort of half right, along come the Russians under Fedorov with a view to probing the British positions. Now, it subsequently transpires that the Russian dead are all carrying entrenching tools, not something that they would normally do in action. And it seems highly likely that the Russians are trying to seize a piece of ground on Shell Hill. We'll get more of a picture of this on the second map in a moment, where they can dig in, establish some sort of redoubt, and be in a position to support whatever operations come next, which is going to be the Great Battle of Inkerman. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. It's a terribly important little battle. Russians come out. Major Hume from the 55th Regiment is up on Home Ridge, and he hears the jingling of equipment off to his rear. The air is still, off to his front, rather, the air is still. He picks up his telescope and he looks across towards the hillside opposite, and he sees guns being moved up directly opposite the British position. He looks again, he thinks, well, whose possible guns can these be? I mean, we've never seen Russian artillery, but then the carriages are painted green. Now, the British artillery have grey carriages. And he suddenly spits his pipe out of his mouth and shouts at the top of his voice, "Green guns, by God, green guns!" In other words, the Russians are here and they're sallying out from Sevastopol, albeit in relatively small numbers. Stand to. The guns, the Royal Artillery guns that are around him, are made ready. De Lacy Evans, the divisional commander, comes forward. However, down on Shell Hill, so immediately to our front, the British pickets are fighting, in other words, the sentries, and they put up far too spirited, an effort to try and keep the Russians at bay. They're meant to shoot, buy time, and then fall back. Lieutenant Connolly of the 49th is up towards the top left side of the pickets. He sees what he would call Muscovites coming at him out of the bushes. His troops in front, they fire a few rounds and then they come running back saying, "Sir, so that there's Muscovites immediately to our front." "Damn it," says Connolly, they'll not have this position. And he goes forward, draws his sword as the Muscovites come out of the brush immediately to his front, and he sees them. He describes them as being as mujiks, in other words, unimaginative, fairly sort of unimaginative soldiers standing in front of him. And he goes for one of the Russians with his sword. The Russian pulls up his rifle, his musket, and his bayonet. The sword falls on the bayonet and snaps in half. He says, "What a useless piece of cutlery!" and chucks his sword at the Russian and then belabors him with his telescope. It's these sorts of little actions all the way across the front which drive the Russians back. Major Champion, who is the major commanding the pickets that day, he's in 95th or Derbyshire Regiment officer. He runs up and down, he rides up and down the line of his pickets on his horse, shouting, "Slate 'em, boys, slate 'em, knock 'em back, knock 'em back." Well, that's not what they're meant to do. De Lacy Evans up on Shell Hill keeps getting messages from the pickets saying, can we have more troops? Nope, you'll not have a single man, Get out the bloody way, pickets. You're masking my guns. You've bought time, you've done your job. Now, please understand that your job is simply to delay. Well, no, the 49th, the 41st, commanded by Champion of the 95th, they fight on. Finally, they're forced back. They're outflanked, and back they come down the valley. De Lacy Evans says, "Right, now's my time." And he starts firing with his 9-pounder guns from Home Ridge, drives the Russians back, and then unleashes two of the finest regiments in the British Army, the 30th or Cambridgeshire and the 95th or Derbyshire, who charge across the hillside, put the Russians to flight. Colonel Fedorov is killed, who's commanding, he's killed at some process of the action. The Russians are beaten. They fall back with terrible casualties inflicted mainly by the rifles of the 95th and the 30th and by the 9-pounders firing from Home Ridge. And they retreat back along the high ground into Sevastopol. There's another little attempt up the Crimean ravine in the middle of the picture. A Russian underground column of Marines comes up along the Crimean ravine. They are repelled by Captain Goodlake of the Coldstream Guards with Sergeant Ashton as his second in command. Goodlake picks up a Victoria Cross. Connolly, the gentleman with the telescope, he also gets a Victoria Cross. But at the end of the day, it is said by Captain Hume of the 55th, the brother of Major Hume. It's 45 minutes of the best training that the British could have had. Well, it's good training. I'm sure it's great fun if you're on the British side, less so if you're on the Russian side. But it has revealed to the Russians exactly what the British plans are should a larger attack fall upon those positions. May we have the second map, please, Jamie? Well, guess what? That's a sort of the same bit of ground, but a different map here. Guess what? The Russian reinforcements are on the way from Bessarabia. Now, where the hell's Bessarabia? Well, if you look at the map of the Black Sea, Bessarabia is the area down to the west and south of Odessa, an area that's very much in the news at the moment. And a very large force under Pavlov, probably about 40,000 men in total. They march in from Bessarabia. They march into the north part of the Crimea. They make themselves available to come down to take part in whatever action they've got planned. And the Russian command is planning what should be, now that the reinforcements arrived, what should be the death knell, what should be the death knell of the Allies who are holding the Inkerman position and indeed the whole of the Sapoon, as mentioned before. What do the Russians intend to do? Well, if you look at the map, you can see that Soimonov's columns, they're going to come out from Sevastopol, just like Fedorov did on the 26th of October. They're going to be joined by Pavlov's crew. You can see them at the top right of the map. They're the boys that have just marched in from Bessarabia, a very long way in from Bessarabia. And then down in the valley, down to the right, Gortschakoff is going to demonstrate in the valley and edging towards the Balaclava position. And Gortschakoff will distract the French and the British further down the ridge, allowing or making sure that no reinforcements come up towards the Inkerman position. At the same time, the Russian guns inside Sevastopol will open fire on the siege lines, and a sally will be made by the Russians inside Sevastopol. So any French reinforcements from Sevastopol siege lines will be pinned. Any French or extra British reinforcements along the Sapoon Ridge will be fixed in place by Gortschakoff down to the right. Meanwhile, allowing, it's hard to know, but probably as many as 60,000 Russians, roughly divided 30,000 in either column. That may be a slight exaggeration, doesn't matter too much, but very, very considerable numbers are going to fall, some from the Sevastopol garrison under Soimonov and some from the external troops under Pavlov are going to fall upon the British, climbing these high slopes that I mentioned, taking on the British on the home ridge, and putting their guns, if you look in the top center part of the screen, on Shell Hill, which we talked about Shell Hill a few moments ago with on the 26th of October. And you can see the artillery that they've got lined up there. It should work perfectly. Isolated from reinforcements, mob-handed, with fresh troops from Bessarabia, should work perfectly. The British at Inkerman are stretched. They are far too short of troops. They've not properly dug in. They've got a few guns. They haven't had time to concentrate on this flanking position. They've been concentrating on the siege instead. And the Russians should roll the 2nd Division up, knock away people like the Guards who will come up to support them, knock away Cascott's 4th Division, whom they know will also come up to support them, and then roll down the ridge, catching the French in the flank, the besieging forces of the Sevastopol, besieging forces from the rear, and then either concentrate the British or drive the British onto the French, or if it's a really good day, drive the British and the French right back onto their ports at Balaclava and on the French port, with a view to making sure that the Allies can either not operate or, even better, decide to get up back on their ships and disappear whence they came. Well, good plan, well organized, good staff work. The operation orders go out the day before on the 4th of October, but there's a couple of very important buts. The ground is terrible, just dreadful. And those of you that have walked with me know that for whatever age we are, let's kindly call ourselves in our early 60s, we're probably not, that we have the greatest of difficulty climbing up those slopes. Now, a 25-year-old experienced fit infantryman carrying, 40 pounds, even he is going to have a really difficult time getting up and around and onto these hills. The British have dug in. They've got their partially dug in. They've got their guns on home ridge. You can see that in this central right part of the map. And then they've got a little thing called the sandbag battery, high right, which is looking out over the Chenea Valley. It's not got any artillery guns in it, but it does have a picket, in other words, an infantry detachment in there. And then they've got the 2 brigades of De Lacy Evans' 2nd Division, Pennefather's brigade and Adams's brigade. And they're standing by. You can see the camp in the central right-hand part of the screen. Off to the left, the careening ravine, which we're worried about, is now properly picketed by the Brigade Guards. They've got troops there guarding the Allies' right, or the British right flank. But it's nonetheless an extremely exposed position on very, very difficult ground. Now, I could spend the rest of my time talking to you about people coming and going and general this and brigadier general that and corporal this and sergeant that. And well, I'll do a bit of that, but I want to try and simplify this battle. The ground is difficult. The Russians have a couple of disadvantages, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the morning of the 5th of November, 1854, dawns very, very foggily, which will be the most enormous asset to the small number of British who are defending the position, and a great disadvantage to the large number of Russians who are attacking. Now, open your Clausewitz. I know you've got it just to hand. I'm sure you have. And you'll see that if you're going to attack, you need to attack broadly in a proportion of 3 or 4 to 1. The Russians are attacking in probably 5 or 6 to 1. The British defences are weak. They've only got one division, namely the 2nd Division. They've been mauled at the Alma, and they're also tired from not only guarding this flank, but also having to carry out the siege duties inside Sevastopol. The Russians slightly miscalculate. Soimenov, you can see him top left, he's meant to come along St. George's Ravine, get his guns in position on Shell Hill. You can see the Russian gun line, top part of the map. And then pause, maybe engage the British pickets. It doesn't matter too much. And wait for Pavlov, top right, you can see, to cross the river Chernaya. That's the little bit of river you can just see sticking out top right corner of the map, and join him up on these heights, so that he's going to be presenting the British with gusty, maybe 60,000, somewhere about 60,000 troops with whom he will be attacking. And remarkably, they finally assess that 92 Russian guns are going to eventually be in place on Shell Hill, which, as you will remember, from the 26th of October, has now been thoroughly reconnoitred. Well, the Russians know exactly the range to Shell Hill. They're much, much stronger in artillery, much stronger in manpower, but they're attacking, they're not defending. And the great difficulty, having a lot of guns is great, a lot of ammunition is even better, but the difficulty with that is the fact that, of course, you're not firing from static, pre-prepared positions where you know exactly what you're firing at. Secondly, you're actually arriving just as dawn is coming. And thirdly, it's blinking foggy. So although the guns on Shell Hill are well within, the guns on Home Ridge, the British guns on Home Ridge, are well within range of the Russians, the small number, and it's probably no more than about 18 British guns initially. These 18 guns firing, let's say, about 60 or 70 Russian guns as they come up, they have a huge advantage in terms of knowing exactly where they're firing and firing from pre-prepared defensive positions with plenty of ammunition being available. Nonetheless, the Russians hugely outnumber. Soimenov commits his troops too quickly in the fog. His leading columns get drawn into the fight too quickly before Pavlov has arrived. The opening parts of the battle are remarkable in as much as small numbers of British troops are managing to defend the left flank of the British position. Captain Clifford of the Rifle Brigade tells the most remarkable story. He comes forward with his brigade commander, who's a man called Buller. Buller's son, by the way, you probably know Buller's son from the Zulu War, where he wins a Victoria Cross at Klavani Mount, and then goes on to the South African War, where he doesn't distinguish himself quite so. Anyway, Buller Senior is not admired by Captain Clifford, who is his aide-de-camp, his young Rifle Brigade aide-de-camp. And as they move forward with reinforcements along the edge of the careening ravine, which you can see there on the left-hand side, Buller suddenly says, "What on earth do you think that is down there in the fog in front of us?" To which Clifford says, "Brigadier, what do you think it is?" And he said, well, it looks to me like a very great number of Russian infantry. Yeah, well spotted, Brigadier. That's exactly what it is. Well, says Buller, what do you think we should do? I tell you exactly what we should do. 77th Regiment, that's following me, with ball cartridge load, spread yourselves out into assault, fix bayonets, and follow me. Well, Clifford, we don't really know what happens to the brigade commander, but Clifford spurs his horse forward with the 77th shouting and bellowing on either flank. Clifford himself engages a Russian. Russian soldier comes forward a little bit, but he pulls his musket up to defend himself from Clifford, who's on horseback, who's wielding his sword with a great deal of strength. The sword strikes the barrel of the musket, cuts all the way down the barrel of the musket, and slices off poor old Ivan's right hand, which is somewhere down on the lower part of the musket. A hand, let's say, it may not want his right hand. Anyway, the poor old Russian, of course, reels away, absolutely reels away with this grievous injury. Fast forward 24 hours, Clifford comes back to the field the day after the battle, goes to a dressing station and finds the Russian, the very Russian. How does he know it's the Russian? Because this Russian comes out with a bandaged hand from the dressing station saying, Johnny, Johnny, Bono, Johnny, Johnny, Bono. In other words, Britisher, you are a good fellow. Now, I'm not quite sure why he thinks he's a good fellow for cutting his hand off, but there we are. Clifford, one of the first Roman Catholic officers ever to be commissioned into the British Army, takes a bag of gold, throws it to the Russian, who catches it with his good hand with an enormous smile on his face and shouts, Bono, Johnny, Bono, and disappears into history. We don't know what happens. Anyway, the left-hand side, the left flank of the position is resisted. And at the same time, Pavlov's troops begin to start making an impression over on the top right flank towards the sandbag battery. The guards, 3 battalions of guards, you can see them middle right-hand side of the picture. They're actually labelled 2nd Coldstream, 1st Scots Fusilier Guards and 3rd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards. The guards are coming up, but the 41st Welsh Regiment are holding the sandbag battery. Now, the sandbag battery, I know it well. I'm going to have a quick brag. I'm the first Brit to have been in the sandbag battery probably since 1904, when the survivors of 1854 visited on the 50th anniversary. It's hard to find. Some of you that have listened to it have been with me, and we've managed to find it again. When I first visited the sandbag battery in the 1990s, it was reasonably obvious what had gone on there, because you could still see the ramparts just in amongst the trees. But all around the sandbag battery, there were human remains, skulls, ribs, teeth, femurs, almost full skeletons. They'd clearly been shallowly buried there. And I had a Russian with me at the time who said to me, oh, well, no, this is from the Second World War. You're not quite in the right position here for what you're looking for. Well, mercifully, we found a combination of British bayonet tips that are obviously broken off, Russian percussion caps that were there, so the things that make a percussion musket go off, and then eventually we found a button of the 19th, the Russian 19th Regiment, and also a button of the Grenadier Guards, conclusively proving that we were in the sandbag battery. Now, the Taratini, they are the first regiment to arrive opposite the sandbag battery. They're not part of Pavlov's forces, they're actually part of Soimonov's forces, and they leak right the way down from the left-hand side of the battlefield, and they're attracted, obviously, to this battlefield magnet, as I would call it, this little British defence that's sitting on the right flank. Captain Hodasevich of the Taratini, he talks about the fact that they move up the ridge line, they move up these terribly strong, difficult ridges. The Russian artillery is firing hard now over the right shoulders through the fog. But as they come upon the sandbag battery, they don't know who they are, but they're actually the 41st Welsh Regiment with their colours. And they're standing there. Captain Hamilton is standing with the regimental colour of the 41st. And the Taratini comes storming into the redoubt. It's a sandbag battery. It's a lunette. It looks like a half moon. It's about 40 foot, I suppose, from the left tip to the right tip, with 2 embrasures in it. And it's about 10 to 12 foot high of piled sandbags with 2 embrasures in it for the guns that are not there to fire through. Hodasevich says his men leap through the embrasures, and they're then met immediately by volley firing 41st, who pour Minier ammunition into them at close range, and then bayonet them. They come in good and hard, and bayonet the Tarantini, throw them out of the sandbag battery. Tarantini, 4 battalions strong, strongly counterattack the 400 strong 41st, eject the 41st, and suddenly the sandbag battery is in Russian hands. Well, don't hold your breath, Russians, because coming up hard are the battalions of the Brigade of Guards, the Grenadiers, the Coldstream, and the Scots Fusilier Guards. First to arrive, 3rd Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, who see what's going on in the sandbag battery. They pause, they gather their breath. The Duke of Cambridge, the brigade commander, is shortly behind them, just behind the brigade headquarters. They leave the colours of the 3rd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards. The men draw their breath, they fix bayonets, and then down the shallow ridge they charge against the Tarantini. And again, the same sort of performance goes on with the Tarantini crossing bayonets with the 3rd Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, firing as hard as they can to try to keep them away. But these bare-skinned, grey-coated soldiers in the fog get the better of the Russians, push them out of the sandbag battery, and then, as you can see from the contour lines behind, the Russians spill back out of the battery and down into the valley, down to the right. Well, that's the first encounter at the sandbag battery. There are 7 more captures and recaptures of the sandbag battery throughout the day. The stories are quite extraordinary. Jamie, could I just have a clean screen for a moment, please?
All right.
So could I just, yeah, thanks. So now I want to tell you about this gentleman. Here we are. This is his shako. And this is the shako that belongs to the MacDonald of Glencoe. Now, obviously, a Scotsman like that, a Scottish nobleman like that, in which regiment is he serving? Well, he's serving in 95th, the Derbyshire Regiment. Of course he is. Of course he is. MacDonald is the man I mentioned before at the Alma. He's the fellow that was knocked over by a shot that hit his crossbelt plate. The commanding officer came up to him and said, and the bullet stuck there in his crossbelt plate. And the commanding officer said, MacDonald, I'd sooner have that crossbelt than a medal. Well, MacDonald by now is the adjutant. He's been promoted because everybody else is dead or wounded as a result of the Alma. Been promoted to captain. He's now the adjutant. He was a light company subaltern of the 95th. And he is riding down on his horse, himself and the commanding officer, this chap called Champion, whose name I have mentioned before. Champion and MacDonald are riding down the ravine, bringing with them a wing of the 95th Regiment. So probably, I don't know, about 200, quite small numbers of the 95th with them as reinforcements for the guards who are around the sandbag battery. MacDonald is terribly short-sighted. The ground is extremely unsuitable to be on horseback. It's broken, it's extremely steep. And as they ride down with the troops behind them, with the soldiers behind them, through the fog, they suddenly hit by a smatter, probably of shrapnel fire, maybe shell fire from the Russian guns that are firing at them through the fog from Shell Hill over their left shoulders. Major Champion says, God, I'm hit. And he falls from his horse. So the commanding officer of the 95th falls from his horse, whilst MacDonald, the adjutant, dismounts and goes up to him and says, you've been struck through the thigh, sir, but I'll get a bandage on that, and you'll be just fine. No, damn it, says Champion. Get the soldiers to do that. You turn around now, MacDonald, and get yourself back up the ravine and find the troops, find our reinforcements, and for God's sake, go and support the guards who are under serious pressure to our right rear inside the sandbag battery. Well, MacDonald can't ride anymore. The ground's too steep. He leads his horse back up the ravine, and then to his great delight, immediately in front of him, he sees a formed company of British troops. So it's foggy, hard to see them, but he can see their grey greatcoats. The Russians have removed their leather helmets, more of which in a moment, and they're wearing little soft, round, grey caps with grey greatcoats. The British are wearing little soft, slightly darker colour, round caps with grey greatcoats. So up goes MacDonald and he shouts out at the top of his voice, "Who are you? Who are you?" To this gang of people that are standing in the fog and the brush, to which they shout out, "Da, Tovarish, do svidania," or something along those lines. It's a company of blinking Russian infantry, probably from the Selenginsk, who I'm going to talk about in a moment. They see MacDonald coming up, leading his horse, and they give him a good smattering of small arms fire. One round of which wounds him in the thigh, and then the Muscovites, as he would call them, come rushing forward at him with their bayonets. Now, luckily, there's one of the private soldiers from the Grenadier Company who is also with MacDonald at the time. And MacDonald turns to this man whose name is Cody and says, get back, save yourself, save yourself." "No, sir, I can't possibly." The Russians pour in upon poor old MacDonald and they bayonet him. Maybe 18 times, it's not clear, but he ends up like a blinking pincushion on the ground. He's got his sword in his hand. He brings his sword up to defend himself. A Russian officer comes up and he recognizes him as a Russian officer. And he says in French, "Call your men off, for God's sake. I'm a gentleman, I'm an officer. Call your men off." And the Russian says, "Ha ha," comes in and cuts him across the head with his saber. Now, by all accounts, well, if fate is right, that's the end of MacDonald, stabbed, shot, and cut with a saber. Well, next morning, so fast forward, the regiment sends out its medical parties to pick up the wounded that are lying out on the field of battle. And one of the soldiers says, "Good Lord, look, it's Captain MacDonald, it's the adjutant." They take off his shako. Now, it's not quite this shako, but it's the earlier pattern, but this is actually MacDonald's shako from 1855, so slightly. And they say the shako is full of blood, completely full of blood. So they carry out the famous and extremely technical test on whether a man is dead or whether he has still got breath in his body. Do they put a mirror to his mouth? Do they feel for a pulse? Nope. One man catches him under the knees, the other one catches him under the shoulders. They lift him up 2 foot and then they drop him. Now, if the wounded man goes, "Ooh, God blimey," or worse to that effect, he's alive. If he doesn't say anything, he's dead. Well, MacDonald is clearly alive. They pack him off, they get him back, blah, blah. That's fine. Fast forward again, to the following year, by which time MacDonald comes back to the regiment, having recovered. He goes to the field of Inkerman. He goes to the bush under which he's lain. He cuts a stick. Which looks a bit like this. It's not actually, that's not MacDonald's, that's not from the 55th, but he cuts a stick that will end up looking a bit like this as a walking stick. You know how keen the Victorians are on the walking sticks. And eventually, when he gets back to Portsmouth, he takes the stick into a jeweler there, explains his story, and says, "Right, I'd like this stick mounted in silver, please. Can you do that?" And yeah, no doubt with sort of regimental inscriptions on it, this, that, and the other. And the jeweler says, "Absolutely fine. Ready in 3 weeks, sir." So he comes back in 3 weeks. "He's got that stick of mine?" "Yep, here it is, sir." And he passes in the stick, and it's all done up in tissue paper. He takes the tissue paper off the stick. Must have looked very much like this. And he says, "Cool, that's absolutely beautiful, but you've mounted it in gold and not in silver." And the jeweler says, "Yes." He said, "Well, it's going to cost me a blinking fortune for you to do that." And the tailor and the jeweler says, "Well, we would, sir, but this is our present to a British hero." Now, MacDonald carries that stick for the rest of his life. He ends up as the commandant of Edinburgh Castle, the fort major, and he actually dies. He lives on the Isle of Man, but he actually dies relatively young in the 1870s, never having married, never having anybody else, and therefore, sadly, there's no one to inherit any of these things. However, they have come to light. Talk about them. But let's go back now. Let's go back to Anthony Morgan. Now, Anthony Morgan's this bloke here in the picture behind me. I've talked about him endlessly. I mentioned last time, here's his sword. And here's his sword. This is the sword that he had at the Alma. This is the sword with which he watched the charge at Balaclava. Clearly, he's an infantryman, so he didn't charge himself. And it's absolutely plain. You can see the blade. It's not inscribed at all. But he says that at Inkerman, he runs through 2 Muscovites and hacks a third. Now, who knows what that means? Clearly, he stabs a couple of Muscovites, of Russians, and he hacks and cuts another one probably across the shoulders or face or whatever with this very sword. What's fascinating, and I'm sorry I can't really show you the details on this, but the blade is plain, except on the fuller, on the back, it reads, sorry, got it the wrong way up, it reads, where are we? Alma Inkerman Sortie, October the 26th, Sevastopol, Morgan, Captain, 95th Regiment. There's his sword. That's accounted for at least 2, maybe 3 Russians, as far as we know. And his story is simply that he's fighting slightly further back. He's not down at the sandbag battery, but he's fighting slightly further back at another defensive position called the barrier. The barrier is held by a small number of men, probably no more than 600 or 700 throughout the day. Sandbag battery similarly has to resist these constant onslaughts against the Russians. The stories are just extraordinary. They're not just extraordinary from the British, but they're extraordinary from the Russians as well. Let me just show you this picture here. It's not a particularly, well, it's not terribly clear here, but this shows Russian infantry. I'll get it up a bit closer. This shows Russian infantry in action. And looking at it, you'd think, aha, that's the Crimea, quite clearly the Crimea. No, it's not. It's not. It's exactly a year before, well, one day out, 4th of November, 1853, when Pavlov's gang, so the lot that have come up as reinforcements, they're fighting the Turks down on the Danube, and the Russians get a right good clothing at the Battle of Oltenitsa, which, you know, I challenge anybody to put that on a map. I can, just because I spent bloody ages looking for it. But the Turks get the better of the Russians, and the particular heroes of that battle are, the good old Serjeants. Here we are. That's one of the helmets that they would have worn at Oltenitsa. You can see the numbers 21 there on the front. They're not wearing these, so they get to the Crimea wearing these helmets, but in action they wear the soft little caps that we've been talking about. A flamboyant headdress, as you can see. It's a handsome thing, or maybe you might think it's bloody ugly actually, but there we are. It's absolutely right for the time. The Serjeants, for instance, they've been in action against the Turks exactly a year before. They arrive on the 3rd of November after having marched in from Bessarabia, which is, I don't know, but at least 300 miles, 280 miles, something like that, long march. And they're told, by the way, you're attacking tomorrow over ground that you don't know, against people that do know the ground extremely well, namely the British. And you're going to find yourself linking up with troops who know the ground, who are coming out from Sevastopol. And there is a representation, there's a deputation from the troops that go to the officers and say, look, hang on a minute, sir, look, exactly a year ago, so on the 4th of November, we got a right good seeing to by the Turks. We're superstitious people. We're deeply religious. We're deeply superstitious as well. We don't want to attack on the first anniversary of a defeat. The Russian High Command say, okay, yeah, we buy that. We absolutely buy that. And therefore they delay it by one day. Nonetheless, regiments like the Serjeants are going into action with this hideous memory that they've had of the year before. And actually the British say that when they strip the bodies of the Russian dead, which they do, it's a customary thing. Both sides will strip before they get buried, the bodies will be stripped. Many of the Russians, all of whom are described as being well-muscled, not terribly tall, but athletically built young men, many of them bearing the marks of former wounds. Now, where have they come from? Well, clearly we don't know, but I can only imagine these are Pavlov's men that clashed with the Turks the year before. And any of you that had the pleasure of meeting fast-moving metal at an earlier stage of your career will know that a wound takes it out of you, in big time. I sympathize with these men, and they attack incredibly bravely. It's not just the Serjeants, clearly it's the Okots, the alternate, the Tarantini, all sorts of different Russian regiments, the Vladimir, the Moscow regiment, the Azov regiment, etc. They come on time and time and time again up these dreadfully difficult gullies that I have mentioned. Their priests are right in the front rank with them, dressed in canonical clothes, with next to the priest will be a young soldier carrying a religious icon. The drums will be beating on either side of them. And they come time and time again, mob-handed, to meet mad, fighting mad British who are in the glens and the glades and the fog and the drizzle, underneath the pounding Russian artillery fire, certainly advantaged by having a rifle rather than a musket, which is much harder hitting than the Russian musket. Nonetheless, the gallantry of both sides, I'm not going to for one moment say that the Russians cut and run or that the British had a huge advantage. Any advantage that the British had was moral because of far fewer numbers. Probably at best, the British put about 8,000 troops into action on the top of Home Bridge. The Russians are certainly facing that with no less than 20 and maybe 30, possibly 40,000 troops at the best of times, supported by 92 guns. So very unevenly matched. But the British know the ground. They know every single dip, every bush. They've been on this ground for 6 weeks beforehand, and they know it intimately. Now, again, I can spend the next several hours describing the ins and outs of all of these things. The battle goes on from dawn right the way through until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The casualties on both sides are extraordinary. They are mainly inflicted by the artillery of both sides, and then the infantry fighting, when it occurs, certainly starts with the discharge of muskets and rifles, but very quickly devolves or degenerates into bayonet fighting. And there are many casualties, both Russian and British, that are seen the day after the fighting with their features completely unrecognizable, probably having been dropped with a bayonet and then finished off with the butt of a musket or a rifle. Private Palmer, for instance, of the 3rd Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, he's trying to support his officer who's counterattacking through the embrasures of the sandbag battery. He talks about leaping amongst the Muscovites, dropping a Muscovite to the ground with a single thrust of the bayonet. That Muscovite, who's obviously is that Russian who is wounded rather than dead, then grabs him round the knees on the ground. Another Russian comes at him. He shoots one of the Russians. Clearly, he has a single shot weapon with his rifle. He puts that Russian down. He disappears into the fur and the fog. But the next Russian comes at him and stabs him through the cheek. The bayonet goes in here and it comes out here on the other side of his face. He says he just has time to realize that he can spit teeth out from his mouth before he has time to pull back from the Russian that stabbed him and club the Russian to the ground, meanwhile trying to kick the Russian that's holding him round the knees. The Sergeant Major Agar, so what would now be called the regimental Sergeant Major, shouts at Palmer, "Don't kick a man when he's down." Palmer has a rather different idea about all of this. He's trying to get after his officers and trying to save them. There's a moment of huge crisis when the guards pursue the Russians over the lip of the sandbag battery and go back right down into the bottom of the valley trying to chase them. The 20th or East Devonshire Regiment, they follow them 21st Royal North British Fusiliers, 95th or Derbyshire Regiment, they also pursue them. They get outflanked. The Russians come behind them, and suddenly they're in low ground with the Russians above them, not just in front of them, but now behind them as well. Captain MacDonald of the 95th, he describes that he gets down into the bottom of the valley, and suddenly he's aware of Frenchmen, Zouaves, in other words, French soldiers dressed in North African native costume. These are the reinforcements I'll talk about in a moment. That Zouaves are coming up behind him, rushing down the valley, screaming and shouting, with great white spats flashing in the fog and the drizzle. One of these Zouaves comes rushing past MacDonald, sees two Russians in front of him, stabs one, butts the other one to the ground with his rifle, and MacDonald says, "Thank you." To which the Zouave replies in perfect English, "No, thank you, old boy. It's so nice to see you again." Now, MacDonald hasn't the slightest, sorry, Carmichael, I'm sorry if I've been using the word, but Carmichael hasn't the slightest idea who this Zouave is. But the Zouaves at this time are a sort of foreign legion. And this is probably an English gentleman of some sort that's ended up as a private soldier in the Zouaves, complete with beard and moustaches and turban and all the rest of it. And he disappears back into the fog. Well, you know, who on earth is this? What's that meeting all about? They have to fight back up the hill, back into the sandbag battery. Meanwhile, the French are arriving, more artillery is arriving, and to cut an extremely long story short, by around about midday, something like that, the British and the reinforced British artillery with French artillery is finally getting the better part of the Russian guns up on Shell Hill. The final note of the exchange of shot and shell belongs to the barrier, so the organization that's to the left of the sandbag battery. At the barrier, they detect that the Russian artillery fire is slackening, and a Captain Ackland of the 77th Regiment, he decides that he's going to go up with his company up the hill and to try and counterattack the Russian guns that are firing at them from Shell Hill. He says to it, "Come on, men, follow me," and the men melt away. They melt away into the fur and the brush and the fog. And he says, come on, what's wrong with you? Get after me, come on." To which there is no response. These are men that have fought 5-6 hours hard, hand to hand with the Russians. No wonder they're tired. No wonder they're scared. Of course they're scared, but they're exhausted as well. Acton says, well, fine. If you won't follow me, then I will go by myself. I don't know why his sword's in his scabbard, but he draws his sword and heads back up Shell Hill by himself. And eventually a corporal stands up and says, damn it. We can't leave him by himself, men. Come on. And this company of the 77th, with a few men of the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, they mount an uphill bayonet charge against the Russian guns, which are now being heavily pummeled by the British and the French artillery on the top of the ridge. It's the moment of victory. This one example by a junior officer, by a handful of British troops, manages to overcome or to get in amongst the Russian gun line and cause the Russian guns to start withdrawing, a little bit like the Alma, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago. I can go on and on and on about this. By about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 8,000 British, reinforced by maybe 6,000 or 7,000 Frenchmen who don't really get into action very much. I'm not denigrating the French for one moment. I can, but I won't at the moment. They beat about 40,000 Russians actually in actions, many more on the field of battle, but they forced the Russians back by virtue of the fog, by virtue of the fact that the Russians cannot properly see their targets, by virtue of the fact that the Russians don't properly know the ground, and by virtue of good old-fashioned British pluck. And instead of waiting for officers to tell them what to do, private soldiers, junior non-commissioned officers and subalterns, simply taking the war to the enemy. Now, you can say, well, what choice did they have? It's not like the Peninsula or one of the, or even the Sea Corps for that matter. These British and Frenchmen who have invaded the Crimea, they have nowhere to run. If they run away and they go back down to the ships in Balaclava or the French port, they'll be arrested as deserters. So possibly this is just the better part of cowardice in this shape. No, it's not. It just isn't. I'm sorry, I'm not having it. If you listen to the British officers, their accounts, the men that day, they were remarkable. They were full of pluck and courage. They would not stop. They kept on going forward. Now, I can eulogize Tommy Atkins for the rest of the night. I can eulogize his French counterpart. But the people really that need to be remembered in this are the Russians. All the disadvantages that I've just described are not overcome by the heavy preponderance of artillery, the weather, the ground, their lack of familiarity with the ground, and some cases poor lower level leadership means that the Russians are pushed back. At the end of the day, there could well have been about 60,000 troops, one way and another, at its height on the battlefield. But of those 60,000, there are 5,000. 5,000 are dead. Probably 3,000 or 4,000 Russians and slightly over 1,000 British and a handful of Frenchmen. I've said this before, but if you go back to Inkerman, and frankly, that's a little bit unlikely just at the moment, and you know where to go, you can still find our soldiers. They're still lying there. They're not in serried ranks as they might be in the war cemeteries in France and Flanders, or indeed in Italy, or indeed in Normandy. Their bones are sticking up from the ground. I'm not trying to sound too emotional about this, but it's an interesting thing to see. And it's not, and many of the bones, if you look carefully at them, they're torn, they're hit by high velocity or low velocity ammunition. They've got the marks of bayonet wounds on them. Scattered around the dead are percussion caps, which shows that the fighting has been intense. And if you're lucky, you'll find a regimental button, either British or Russian, or perhaps I know people that have found guardsmen's cap badges. The other regiments don't wear cap badges at this stage, and British regimental buttons there at the time. The thing I would say is that the modern Russians have studied this time and time and time again. They are profoundly impressed by what happened at Inkerman. And there's a couple of Russians that I know who have gone out there, and I'm talking 20, 25 years ago now, but they've cleared the ground. They've tried to pick up the human remains that are there and have buried them. Sadly, those graves have subsequently been robbed, but nonetheless, some of you have already been with me to Inkerman, and you will know what an extraordinary achievement it was and what a great tribute to Russian valor it was. The fact remains that although the Russians lose the battle, they so badly degrade the British fighting power, and to a lesser extent the French fighting power, that the Allies attempt to get into Sevastopol before the winter, which is clearly what they're trying to do, fails. The British and the French simply now do not have the manpower to prosecute the siege successfully. It's going to take at least 8 months before the British and French can reinforce in such a way that they can have a go at Sevastopol, which they do in June 1855, and that fails. So there we are. I will finish with this little couplet. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, bayonets, and shot, when General Liprandi charged Tom, Pat, and Sandy, and a damn fine licking he got. There we are. That's it.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was excellent. Very, very good indeed. Any questions?
Yeah, Patrick, can I ask, at the end of the battle, was that it as far as the Russian army of the interior was concerned? Did they get involved anymore so we could concentrate on Sevastopol?
No, very good question, cousin, if I may. And I know that you're going to say that if there'd been any constituent parts of the Royal Anglian Regiment present at this battle, then of course it would have been a completely different conclusion. However, just leave it to your youngers and your betters to deal with things in this particular time, unlike the Sikh battles, I might add. The Russian army of the interior grows in strength. They have another go, a sort of copy of Inkerman in August 1855, and they fall upon the house of the Italian troops that have come out to reinforce. and also the French troops at a place called Chenea. There are a handful of British who are involved down there, and it's another stunning defeat for the Russians. That field of battle is even less visited than Inkerman and has lots and lots of things to see upon it, but doesn't actually involve the British. The Army of the Interior continues to make a blinking nuisance of themselves until Sevastopol falls.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Colin, Richard?
Well, in a minute, I've got to look something up.
Yeah.
You're in trouble, Patrick.
Well, I'm trying to locate exactly where Richard and I stood with a concrete pedestal with, was it a David a VC?
That was right up on Shell Hill, Colin, if you remember. You were standing up on Shell Hill where Connolly of the 49th won his Victoria Cross, within a few feet of you. He's the gentleman I described attacking the Muscovites with his telescope. Yeah.
But it's great having the lecture like this, Patrick, because the whole place is covered in greenery and trees and little trees that it's damn nearly impossible to. Well, we tried to imagine it with you where you were explaining things, but having seen the maps again, it makes it much easier to understand. But incredible. So thank you very much.
The British do say that most of the day was like jungle fighting. Now, make of that what you will, Colin. Is that the sort of thing that you'd see in Malaya, or do they just mean thick brush? I do think that when we were there, a lot of the stunted oak that we saw, that must have been very similar to the stuff that was there in 1854.
You reckon?
Yeah, not as widespread as that for sure, but yeah. there were clumps of it certainly inside the ravines.
Because you wouldn't. I mean, we actually had to use our whistles to find you, or you to find us.
Yeah.
Because it was so damn thick.
Yeah.
I can't see how, if you're on the ground trying to fight, you can see hardly anything in front of you.
No,
I know
that's modern fir, Colin, that's been planted, I should think, in the 1960s. But if you can picture the sandbag battery where we were, which you're right, you can't see a damn thing from the sandbag battery, to the point that, if you recall, you and I had to use compasses to get in there. At the time, I've got contemporary sketches. My friend, my mate Algernon Percy, whose great grandfather won a Victoria Cross, if you remember, in the sandbag battery. He's got some sketches that Percy made at the time, and there's almost no undergrowth to be seen there at all.
Oh yeah, certainly up on the top there. I don't remember. Yeah, we walked through a bit of fir going down, didn't we?
We did. Yeah, we did. Yeah,
yes. I was trying to work because it was a mighty hot day.
Extremely hot, and there were quite a lot of snakes around as well, if you remember.
Yeah, we didn't see any there.
I did.
Did you? Oh, you didn't.
Yeah.
You did?
Well, I didn't say anything. Of course, I didn't say anything. Otherwise, half the park screaming to the blinking hotel.
Oh, poor old Richard would have run a mile.
Yeah, Richard.
No, he would not.
When he got Julia.
Patrick, one of the things that the maps didn't have was any sort of scale. What was the distance from where this Inkerman was to Sevastopol?
Right, Inkerman to Sevastopol is about 3 miles.
3, you say 3?
Yeah, to this. Actually, no, it's less than that. It's probably about 2 miles to the central part of Sevastopol, which is Russian Hill. And the ranges of the guns from Shell Hill. I wish we could go out there, David, because it's a fantastic battlefield. The ranges from Shell Hill to Home Ridge are around about 1,200 yards. So absolutely perfect medium artillery ranges.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. And there was no coordination between Russians inside Sevastopol and the Army of the Interior.
Yeah, if you remember, I tried to explain one column comes from the interior of Sevastopol.
Yes, okay.
To that Stoimanov's gang, who are going to meet up with Pavlov's gang, who've come from the exterior. The liaison should work. It's actually, as I say, the operation order is very well written.
Right.
But Simonov gets a rush of blood to the head and decides he wants to try and kill redcoats before his mate turns up. And that really is the start of when the Russian plan unravels.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Jeremy, do you have any questions? Richard, you got a question?
I have a question. Patrick, you've given us a wonderful summary of the aggression shown by the British from private up to officer, particularly the privates. Now, they're able to do this because mostly it's hand to hand. How does this translate to today, where fighting is done long range and often with gizmos? Do you think there's any place for the sort of aggression that we had in those days, or is it going to be an entirely different battle when we actually have to go to war?
Sorry, I should have shown you this. I beg your pardon. This is a Russian sword bayonet taken by the man behind me in the picture at Inkerman. Now, I don't think it was necessarily used on him, but you know, you can see, you're quite right. This is the sort of thing that was being used. Right, Richard, I'll try to keep this brief. For reasons I won't bore you with all of this, but you remember the winning of the Victoria Cross by Sergeant Mackay of the Parachute Regiment in the Falklands. Yes. I had occasion to talk to the people that were heavily involved in that incident. So that's 1982, and they said, you know, it was bitter stuff. 1982. I remember one of them saying to me, he couldn't imagine circumstances in which bayonets and close quarter fighting would ever occur again. Well, my former regiment, which the Tories have now disbanded, in 2009, the regiment was lucky enough to pick up 9 conspicuous gallantry crosses in Afghanistan, of which 5 of them were won with the bayonet. So there's no lack of close hand. I mean, that's some time ago now. That's 10 or 15 years ago now. There's no lack of ability and opportunity to close with the enemy. And if you're looking at the various websites and things that are coming up now from Ukraine and well, between the Ukrainians and the Russians, there's plenty of hand-to-hand fighting going on, plenty. I haven't seen bayonets being used, but certainly hand grenades, submachine guns, rifle fire is commonplace, Richard. Mm-hmm. What I would suggest, and you know, by all means take me to task on this one, is I don't think that if you put the average Briton against the average Russian now, there would be any lack of aggression on either side to close with and kill their opponents, albeit in a friendly fashion.
Of course.
You know what I mean by that. Of course you understand that. But would the West's senior command ever commit troops to this sort of fighting again? Would they? I have a feeling we're going to find out.
Yeah, it could be. Patrick, thank you.
You know, we and I'll sit down and have a drink and talk about this, Richard.
Sooner rather than later, I hope.
Absolutely, I'm up for that.
Great.
You're back drinking again, are you?
Drinking, of course.
Back drinking?
Back drinking, Colin. Yeah. What about it?
Yeah. No, are you?
I'm not. You know me. I barely touch the stuff.
I know. I found a photograph. I don't know. Would you be able to see this? Of the.
Hold it up.
Hold it up.
Hold it up to the camera.
I've lost it.
Oh, see, sorry, it's on the screen. I beg your pardon. Just describe it, Colin.
I've lost it.
Okay.
No, it was the concrete memorial, and one side it's got to the Boys of Scotland.
Ah, right. I'm sorry. I beg your pardon. Right. Let me just describe this. Colin's just described Colin and Richard. They've described the extreme difficulty of finding the sandbag battery. The only way that I can go to the sandbag battery is I've been there lots and lots of times, and every time I used to take groups in, I have to do it with a compass and by pacing through this very, very thick brush that we've just described. I always think that I'm never going to be able to find it again, but I managed to. Yeah, there we are. That's it. Well,
can you read it there or not?
Not sure we can see it, Colin, but thank you for trying. There we were. Yeah, just about. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's it. That's good. Yeah, that's perfect. Perfect. It says Slava Russia. So the glory of Russia, 1854 on one side. Last time, well, when I was there with Colin and Richard and all the rest of it. So that's, what year was that, Colin? Can you remember?
It's 17.
17, right. When we were there in 2017, suddenly out of nowhere, we got to the sandbag battery and there was this funny little memorial. Well, it's not funny, but it's only about 4 foot high.
Yeah.
But I would have thought to carry it, you'd need probably three or four strong men to carry the thing in. It's made out of stone. And to this day, I have absolutely no idea. It's a Russian that's done it, but I have absolutely no idea who put that memorial up.
But on the other side, it's got to the Sons of Scotland.
Yep, interesting, because there were almost no Scottish troops there.
Oh, so they were down in the harbour.
Well, yeah, they were down in the harbour. There was ones. Well, there was a Scots Fusilier Guards and the 21st Royal North British Fusiliers. Other than that, it is almost entirely English and Irish regiments that fight this particular battle.
Thank you. Very good.
No, thank you for reminding me of that. Actually, Colin, the last time I was there, so after our visit, we got in and someone, well, the memorial had fallen over. I don't know if it was pushed over or I've no idea. And we managed to get it back up and re-erect it. But I don't suppose very many people go there.
Rather like we did with Major General Lake.
Absolutely right. Exactly that. Yeah. Exactly, Colin. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Very good.
Well, gentlemen, if that's all the questions, I think I'm going to wrap this up, unless anybody else wants to say anything. If I could just remind you, next Thursday, we got Jonathan Marcus. He was a BBC World Service correspondent. I think he was the defense correspondent. He's going to be talking about lessons of Ukraine. Lessons from Ukraine, which is very apt, I think. So do book your seats if you want to watch that. I think it'll be very interesting in light of the recent news about the Russian withdrawal and what's going on in Ukraine. So if there's no more questions, any more questions?
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Not at all. Jamie, you might think about mentioning Dean Park.
Oh, yes, sorry. Robert Brudenell, who's the ancestor of Cardigan, Lord Cardigan, is a friend of mine. And Patrick would like to take a tour of us to Dean Park, where the Brudenell family live. And if you're interested, I can organise that for you. So I'll put a note around, and if you're interested, do let me know.
Do we have a date in mind?
No, but it won't be this year. It'll probably be next, I think, February, March time.
Mm-hmm.
It's Northamptonshire, by the way.
Okay, look forward to the details.
Yep.
Super.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay,
Patrick.
thank you very much, Patrick, and good night all.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Nasta.